The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander. Normally I'm joined by my co-host Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs, but today, unfortunately, we are recording early in the morning in Asia, and that would have just been an ungodly hour for Cobus to join us today, but he has submitted his questions, so you're going to hear his voice throughout the program. He just won't be here with us in person. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the TICAD Summit, and that might be a new acronym for a lot of you. That's the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. It's coming up next week in Yokohama, Japan, and it is a very, very important summit on the calendar, a very busy calendar, I might add, of African summits around the world. In some ways, it is really second to the FOCAC Summit, which is China's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. This is going to be a big deal. 54 countries and international organizations are going to be there. Some big leaders are going to be there. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is going to be there. Cameroon's Paul Biya will be among the invitees. A lot of money is going to be on the table for African development. But more importantly, one of the things that we're hearing coming out of TICAD this year is going to be an alternative to China. And some of the messaging that the Japanese government is already starting to filter into the kind of messaging bloodstream out on the internet and in the news media is that Tokyo is expected to use the conference to articulate how its approach to aid and infrastructure is different from that of the Chinese. Apparently, in the final declaration, they're going to have a concern over excessive debt. And they also want to emphasize this question of quality, that Japanese-built infrastructure is higher quality than the Chinese. So in some ways, what's very interesting about the Japanese TICAD summit is that it echoes a lot of the same concerns that we hear coming out of the United States with regards to debt and regards to providing an alternative to China and their development strategy in Africa. So I wanted to get some perspective today on TICAD, China, the alternative development structures, the economics of trade between Japan and Africa, and where China fits in all this. And we have an excellent guest joining us from Japan. Jean-Claude Maswana is an associate professor of economics at the University of Tsukuba, which is just located about 60 kilometers outside of Tokyo. His research focuses on macroeconomics, particularly in the field of development economics. Previously he lectured on development economics at two of Japan's most prestigious universities, Kyoto University and Tokyo University. And in his biography, he lists a variety of professional associations that he's a member of. And just based on this alone, you'll know why we asked Professor Maswana to join us today to talk about the upcoming TICAD Summit. Take a listen to this. The American Economic Association, the African Finance and Economics Association, the Chinese Economist Society, and the Japanese Association of African Studies. I mean, that just represents everything that we want to talk about on this show. A very good morning to you, Professor Maswana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Just a small correction. I'm now full professor of economics at Ritsumeikan University in Japan, started from last April.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations. I apologize for the oversight, and we're very excited to have you. Now, you're originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo,
correct,
and you've been in Japan for quite some time, so you're very well positioned to understand the relationship between Japan and Africa. And I think let's just kind of get started with a very general overview of TICAD and why it's important and what it is. And if you could just maybe just introduce us to the TICAD Summit for those of you who are not familiar with it, it might be a good place for us to start our discussion today.
Okay, well, the TICAD, as you rightly put it out, is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. It was established in 1993 following the failure of development in Africa, especially highlighted in the economic crisis of the 1980s. So Japan was the first country to put in place a coherent agenda for African development. in early 90s. But we have also to mention that TICAD, contrary to FOCAC, for example, the TICAD is co-organized with a number of international partners, although it's an initiative by Japan, but it's actually co-organized with institutions such as United Nations, UNDP, the World Bank, and African Union, and the African Development Banks, and some other institutions have joined Japan to co-organize the TICAD event. And then this year we are at the 7th edition of TICAD, and every time TICAD is being held, we have a different leading teams. This year is the team is Advancing Africans Development Through People, Technology, and Innovation. As you can see, especially the two last, concept, technology, and innovation, these two are some of the well-known strengths of Japan. And as you pointed out at the beginning, Japan is trying to highlight the difference between its cooperation and the Chinese one by emphasizing the high quality of its infrastructure, and therefore the emphasis on technology and innovation in this year team. So that's, I think, the overview of this year TICAD I can share.
Well, that's very helpful. So let's talk about China, because it seems like in the run-up to the conference, there's much more talk about China and Japan presenting itself as an alternative to China than there is about some of the other parts of the mission statement for what the summit's supposedly going to be about. And I want to bring up an article that came in Foreign Policy this week by Jay Berkshire Miller, who's a senior visiting fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Tokyo. And he said, Japan is taking on China in Africa. And even the Japanese foreign minister came out recently and said how he's going to talk about how Japanese infrastructure is of higher quality. And it sounds, again, like some of the adversarial tone that has long shaped the China-Japan relationship is now making its way into the Japan-China-Africa relationship. And I'm wondering, that seems contradictory in one sense, because one of the things you've been talking about is how Japan and China have to try and work together and should be better at working together in Africa. So talk to me a little bit about the framing of China with respect to this year's TICAD.
As I put it early, you have to remember that TICAD is co-organized by Japan and other international players when it comes to international development. And then when you look at the background of the shift in Japan focus through TICAD, you have to think of the geopolitical dynamics going on currently at the global level. Some of the direction taken by TICAD or Japan are actually the result of the influence of those institutions and countries co-organizing TICAD. And then if you look at those shifts that we have mentioned, taking on China, this is not really something new. Perhaps in the past, Japan didn't want to make it obvious. But recently, if you look at the stance taken by key players such as United States or European Union, when it comes to China involvement in Africa, and you have to expect really those stance, those positions to be reflected in the TICAD, because those countries are co-organizers of TICAD. So personally, I will not really interpret this as being a shift in the position of Japan, but I will take it as a shift in the position of different players co-organizing TICAD alongside with Japan. That is really my reading of what is going on.
Japan has traditionally followed an aid model similar to that of Europe, but indications are that TICAD 7 might signal a shift to a different form of engagement, one that more directly addresses some of Japan's strategic priorities in Africa. So what are these priorities actually?
Okay, some of the priority of Japan can be easily understood by looking into what is happening in Japan. So in Japan currently, when it comes to Japan own economic development, we have two features that should be of interest of not only those doing research on Japan, but international development stakeholders. One is the demographic decline, so the aging society that is really affecting Japan more than other industrialized countries. The second is the shrinking domestic market in Japan, which is also related to the demographic changes. And the combination of these two is, to some extent, weakening the position of Japan as the de facto leaders of Asia. And to compensate on that, Japan needs really to find at least an external market through which the economic power of Japan can be maintained or even strengthened. And then when we look at the different developing countries or market nowadays, Asian market is rapidly emerging, is rapidly expanding, and China is already occupying much of the emerging market in Asia. And Latin America is traditionally not really a destination for Japanese export. And the competition with the United States there make it very hard for Japan to really seriously consider expanding into the region. And then the only market left, which is still new, which is still untapped, which is still underdeveloped, where Japan have a chance, both in terms of market as well as in terms of sources of primary commodity, of raw materials, is Africa. And then it makes sense from economic point of view that Japan starts seriously thinking or considering African markets, African countries, in terms of true partners, no longer in terms of donor and recipient relationship as it used to be the case until the last decade. So that is in itself explaining why Japan is seriously reconsidering or redefining its economic relationship with the African continent.
So in economic terms, that makes a lot of sense, where Japan sees a potential market, it sees opportunity in Africa, it wants to reshape the relationship. I guess my question is there a broader vision here? So the Chinese have the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of people are criticizing it. It's corrupt, it's big, it's unwieldy, it doesn't really have a core set of values necessarily, but it's there. And in many ways, it is providing shape to Chinese foreign policy in ways that the United States does not have shape to its current foreign policy. And somehow the Japanese feel equally adrift a little bit. I'm going to ask you a question later on about the Africa-Asia Growth Corridor. We're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific and some of these other terms that have really been brought by the United States to put some definition on Japanese foreign policy and their place in the world. But I guess I'm wondering, is there anything similar to Belt and Road that the Japanese have in terms of providing an outline of what their vision is beyond just the economics? Or is it really just about changing an economic relationship either in aid or in trade?
No, I think it's the latter rather than the former, because until now, Japan has, even when we look at it from the diplomatic point of view, Japan hasn't been able to formulate a diplomatic agenda or framework in its dealing with Africa. And then this is one of the core, I will say, the main weakness of even this framework of TICAD altogether, is because it's really the ownership. To what extent is Japan owning this TICAD is really a question in itself. So how much of the TICAD agenda is specifically addressing Japanese own interests, and then how much is addressing Japanese diplomatic and geopolitical partners' interests, sometimes it's really not clear-cut. As a result, it has been very difficult for some African countries to deal with Japan because of that kind of borderline between what is essentially Japanese, what is indirectly the influence of agenda of Japanese partners or co-organizer of TICAD.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Sometimes when I speak with Japanese diplomats, I hear them expressing concern over China's Belt and Road Initiative and its, this kind of big rollout of Chinese influence. But at the same time, I've also heard in the past the mention of the possibility of Japanese companies cooperating with Chinese companies on BRI projects in Africa. How do you think Tokyo sees the BRI? Is it more commercial or is it more geopolitical?
No, definitely Tokyo seeing it as geopolitical more than anything else. And honestly speaking, it's mostly geopolitical. It's a geopolitical tools, or I will put it in this way, it's a geopolitical vision using economic platform or economic framework. So to materialize Chinese geopolitical ambition, China find a much better way of putting it in economic terms. So that is what it is, and nobody will fool themselves by seeing it as something else. That it's a geopolitical vision frame or materialize in economic terms. And Japan see it in that way. And on that, I personally believe that is the correct perspective that Japan is seeing the BRID initiative.
Well, on the geopolitical side of things, there's some interesting changes that are going on now. And the United States' presence in Asia seems to be changing right now. And the politics are changing very quickly. And so what we see, the tensions between Korea and Japan now, many people attribute to a diminished U.S. role that used to kind of bring those two together in opposition to both North Korea and in some ways to keep an eye on China as well. That is going away. And what we saw in the last summit between Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping was a warming a little bit. And what I mean by this is if you look at the pictures and the body language of these two leaders over the years, normally they shake hands, but they're looking away. They look really dour. They look really angry. They don't want to be there. And they're kind of putting on a show for the world to say, we're just doing this because we have to. In the last photo session that they had, and I forget exactly when the summit was, there was a hint of a smile. They weren't actually looking away from each other. They were looking more towards the camera. And if those body language images show us anything, that there is a little bit of a rapprochement, a tiny amount, especially because as the U.S. market now becomes more inaccessible to the Chinese, they may start looking to the Japanese market as an option to backfill some of that opportunity for them. My point here is that Africa presents a very interesting area of converged interest between the Chinese and the Japanese in an area that they can build on mutual trust. Now, every year, the Japanese float this idea of let's work together with the Chinese on development projects. Despite the fact that the Japanese put these ideas out there, I have never seen any interest on the part of the Chinese to do that. So I guess I'm wondering, kind of picking up on the geopolitics and where these intersect and overlap with one another, do you think there's an opportunity in the future that they may see African development as a way to improve and soften some of the tensions that exist in the geopolitical relationship?
Okay, on purpose, we can say yes, because there has been at least public statement. There have been a kind of expression of interest on both sides for joining hands when it comes to African development. And just before getting deeper into your question, I should just mention that personally, I've been involved in the China DAC, OECD DAC study group. And that initiative that started in 2010 to 2012 was aimed at bringing together not only China and Japan, but trying to find a way or the best way that OECD DAC countries can join China and work together when it comes to African development. And then we were able to identify different levels through which cooperation, collaboration can take place. One could be not only really the materialization of project in Africa, but the redefinition of what should be the priority of different international donors or actors when it comes to African development. And then there have been exchange of information among the, at least the JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and the Ministry of Commerce in China, in which myself, I was part in those years, in the early 2010 and 2012 years. There have been exchange of information. This in itself is a form of cooperation. And then coming back to your question, I think Japan and China has been already cooperating when it comes to African development. When you look at the structure of production in Asia, different companies, especially Japanese companies, have moved their production line to China. The assembly lines have been completely moved to China. And when you look at in the past, for example, 24 years ago, most of these companies used to import raw material from Africa and then start the process of transformation in Japan and start the process of making part and component in Japan and then building the end product in Japan and then export them or sell them in a domestic market. Most of these companies have moved the assembly line in China. By moving their assembly line in China, they don't need to import raw material to Japan anymore. The raw materials are being imported by their suppliers in China. And this is a form of joint cooperation that we don't see directly because evidence are very difficult to come up with. But this is really reality that when you observe the way the business is being done in Asia, when you look at into what you call redirection of international trade, you will find that this is really obvious. And when it comes to cooperation on African development, this is one step which is already taking place in Asia. But now, it will take time for both countries to shift, for example, developing mining sites, investing into some mining project in Africa, and so that they can import those mineral resources directly to China or whatever it could be. Next step, it could be Vietnam or Bangladesh or Malaysia, and start the first stage of transformation of those raw materials in Asia. So this is already happening in small scale, but in the future is going to happen at much larger scale as the production cost in China is increasing. This is going to happen at a much faster pace.
So you are going to be speaking at TICAD.
Yes.
At the event. What are you going to talk about?
I will be talking about the exactly what I have answered in your question, how cooperation can be strengthened among Asian key players interested in supporting African development, especially in terms of businesses and less in terms of ODA, official development assistance, but in terms of joint investment and international trade and integrated with intra-regional trade and business in Asia. So I will be looking into how the global value chain led by Asia can be put at the driver's seat when it comes to the Asian economic interaction with African countries.
One of the things I've heard you talk about in the past, and you've touched on it here a little bit, is this idea that both Japan and China have pretty clear visions of what they want from Africa. But yet African leaders sometimes don't necessarily have a clear vision of what they want from these Asian countries, or sometimes even from other countries like Turkey or Russia or whatnot. And I also want to bring your attention to a column that was in the Uganda Daily Monitor by Julius Kapwebwe, and he is the head of the Ugandan Debt Network. And one of the things that he was calling for was more harmonization, in this case among East Africans when they go to TICAD, but also, and this has been a call we've heard for a long time, that rather than country by country going to these summits, that groups regionally or even continental groups go to negotiate better deals and have an integrated solution rather than piecemeal one by one by one. Talk to us a little bit about the African agenda at TICAD and what we can expect to see, what we should see, and what we will see. Sometimes they're not always the same. So talk to us a little bit about what to expect from the African side coming to TICAD.
Okay, so African countries are coming to TICAD, as you have roughly put it, as individual countries rather than as a bloc. And as in the previous TICAD editions, most of African countries, they come to TICAD the same way they often go to FOCAC. They will be attending this event to listen to what Japan and other co-organizers have for Africa on the table. This is really one of the biggest, my criticism of all of these international venues on African development. Normally, African countries should have initiated this event themselves and then inviting their international partners to attend this event. And they should have a clear agenda designed by themselves. Then during this sort of event, one of the issues will have been to discuss their own predefined agenda. This is not the case. When you look at let's see what happened in the case of China, especially in the 90s, by the end of 1980s and the 90s. The Chinese was designing their own development agenda. The 5 years plan that they still develop. And then whenever, for example, partners like the World Bank, which used to provide limited technical assistance, the World Bank was not really taking the lead in defining the theme of the meetings and the agenda of what should be the priority for the Chinese development agenda. But China was developing everything in its own terms based on what China or the Chinese leadership used to see as priorities in line with their own political agenda and geopolitical agenda, and all the international partners involved. They were just coming and then fitting into what the Chinese was defining, and they were just coming with different proposals in terms of this is how we can fit, how our cooperation can fit into your agenda. But in African case, it's just the opposite happening. And this in itself is a problem. Why? Because the implementation of some of these policies, some of the proposal is simply not feasible when it comes to many of the African countries. Countries should have institutional capabilities to materialize some of the ideas, the project recommended by international partners. More than half of African countries don't have institutional capabilities, or sometimes not even human capacity to put in place, materialize some of the policy proposal put in place by gatherings, international venues such as TICAD. They don't have. This is a problem that have been discussed internally in the run to during the preparation for TICAD. These are some of the discussions that have been taking place here in Tokyo. And the problems still remain, and it's very difficult for donor country to take care of everything, including the capacity development that African countries should prepare themselves and some of the agenda that they should define on their own. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I'd like to close our discussion today on what you expect to actually come out of this conference. Now, we're going to see a final communique that's going to have a lot of money attached to it, billions of dollars that are going to be assigned for development. That is, of course, what a lot of people will define the success. And they'll also measure that against the Chinese. In fact, when I was talking about TICAD on Twitter, a lot of people said, 2.8, 4 billion, whatever the numbers are that are going to come out of it, pale in comparison to the 60 billion that come out of the FOCAC. And I don't think that's necessarily the right benchmark to determine success or failure. We're going to see a lot of mention of debt and high quality and the sustainability of debt. And that's going to be a little bit awkward, I think, for a lot of the leaders who will be attending TICAD, because they are the ones who have approved the debt. So, people like Paul Biya are going to go to Tokyo, or Yokohama in this case, and there's going to be all this criticism of excessive Chinese debt, and he's part of the reason why there is that excessive Chinese debt. So I always find that to be a rather unusual, awkward kind of statement. It does reflect the anxiety that the U.S., Japan, and some of the donor community has about the Chinese engagement strategy in Africa. But again, African leaders are also complicit in all of this. So I want to find out from you what you're expecting to be the outcomes. What should we expect to walk away from TICAD after TICAD 7 wraps up next week?
I think based on what I know, what I've been part of, the aspect to pay attention to should be the involvement of business, because this time there will be so many Japanese companies attending the event. And the organizers have invested a lot in terms of making it possible for African delegations to interact with Japanese companies, to have enough time and space to discuss different kind of deals. And many different kind of technical documents have been prepared, which are going to be shared both with Japanese companies and African delegations. And so if there are going to be something a little bit original or hopeful, that will be the outcome of the discussions and interactions between African delegations and Japanese businesses.
Jean-Claude Maswana is a professor of economics at the University of Tsukuba and one of the leading thinkers on Japan, Africa, and even China cooperation and development. He's a development economist there. He's been in Japan for a very, very long time. One of the smartest people out there, and you can follow him on Twitter, where he posts a lot of commentary on these types of things. Professor Maswana, what's your Twitter name that people can follow you and to see what you're reading and writing these days?
So my Twitter name is JC, as a Jean-Claude, so JC in capital letter, and Maswana with M in capital letter, MASWANA.
I cannot recommend enough to follow Professor Maswana on Twitter. Again, some very interesting things. That's where I found him for our conversation today, and so happy we did it. I wish you the very best at the upcoming TICAD Summit, and thank you so much for joining us today on the China in Africa podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the show. Cobus is actually going to be in Yokohama for the TICAD Summit, and so we're going to get his feedback and his reactions on what's going on. We'll post those all throughout the week while he's in Japan, and so we hope to follow this. This is a very important event, and we hope that we can bring a little bit of nuance to the discussion about the Japan-China-Africa relationship. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.